All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Bill Griffin, Professional Development Manager at Informs, and welcome to our latest offering in our sponsored webinar series. Today's webinar is titled The Predictive Modeling Workflow and is brought to you by JUMP. Your panelist today is Kevin Pochner and will be supported by Kurt Heinrich. Kevin will deliver what I'm certain is an informative presentation and will reserve the last 15 minutes for Q&A. Feel free to submit questions via the Q&A function in Zoom, and we'll ask them at the end of the presentation. Without further ado, now I'll turn it over to Kevin. Kevin, take it away.
Okay, thanks very much, Bill. Welcome everybody to today's session. I know for a lot of you, there's a tremendous amount to coordinate with such a crazy time that we're in, and certainly shifting all of your instructional materials and content to teaching in this new virtual world. So hopefully from today's session, you'll actually get some content that you'll be able to use. I mean, there will be a recording of this session, and I'll supply Bill with the data set in case you want to incorporate this into your classroom. So I'm going to turn off my video. I'm going to go to a screen share. So just hold on one second. Okay, Bill, can you just confirm that you can see the title of the PowerPoint slide, full screen?
Looks good. Steam forward.
Perfect. All right, thanks a lot. Okay, so as hold on here, got to get my to move forward. There we go. So we're going to be talking about the predictive modeling workflow, and typically that whole end-to-end is everything from acquiring the data all the way to productionalizing the model. I'm not going to talk about acquiring the data. That's a whole entire effort. Sometimes that's simple. I've been in situations where somebody hands me a data set. It just takes a little bit of cleaning up and it's ready to go. I've also been a part of projects where acquiring the data has taken over a year because it's that complicated and that involved. But we're not going to be talking about that. So I'm going to start off at first focusing on if you have a data set, we're going to do a little bit of validation. We're going to sort of clean up and define the data for analysis, and then we're going to do some initial exploration. So I'm going to start with that, and I'm just going to switch over here to the JUMP software. Okay, so here's our data set. I'm not going to go and explain every variable in detail, but just a big picture. So this is a data set of high school students that are actually in Portugal. This is a data set from the UC Irvine data science library that they have. And the response variables are these three columns here, which are the grades. And it's standardized, right? So it's not in the standard, GPA that we're used to, but, higher the number, the better the score, right? So we've got grade G1 is grade in a time period 1, in a time period 2, and a time period 3, okay? And I also sort of created this variable, which is the difference between the grade in the third period and the first period, and that might be something we could consider looking at. And then all the other variables, okay? And we have 30 different, we'll call them candidate predictive variables. So we've got the school, well, actually, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna just show you this neat little way I can see that quickly. So I've got school, gender, age, address, which is urban or rural. There's family size. There's all sorts of information about their family, like their parents' education, their parents' job, sort of characteristics measured about the students, sort of their activities, like how much time do they travel to get to the school, how much study time. There's even things like, are they involved in a romantic relationship? How much alcohol do they drink? Their sort of health, how many absentees, how many failures they may have had in tests. So there's all sorts of characteristics. So again, I'm not going to go into any more detail than that. However, when I first get a data set, the first thing I do is, okay, what is this data set? I try to get a sense of the range of all the values, and you can sort of see here with this little display at the top. I'm going to show something in a moment that's going to see that a little bit bigger, but just want to use this as a quick way to see. So for example, you can see that there are 2 schools, GP and MS. Okay, we've got 2 addresses, urban, rural, 2 categories of family size, et cetera. Okay, and then you can see the different, right now I'm clicking on the jobs of their parents. Okay. Now, something you might notice if you're looking at the data table, and I'm just going to scroll a little bit to see if you can see some of it. You may notice that there are some missing values, which is very, very common in a data set. And I always like to take a look at what those are because sometimes there's some information in there. So I'm going to do that. And I am just going to see, put in all the variables here. And I just pulled up basically a data table that summarizes that missing data pattern. And so what this basically is telling me is that there are 402 students out of there's actually down here on the lower left where I'm moving my cursor, there's a total of 649 students in this data set. But out of all those, there's only 402 that have no missing values across all of the variables. I'm just going to click on another one so you get the idea. Another one here is there are 26 students or 26 rows where there's 1 missing value, and I'm going to scroll over to find it, where there's 1 missing value in this variable called go out, which is basically how much they socialize. Okay. So it's a good idea to look at this because now I might decide if I want to work with a different set of data, maybe a subset of the data. Maybe I only want to analyze the students that have complete information. But it's kind of nice to take a look at this. And I'm going to do one more thing with this missing value idea, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to put all of these variables in. Oops. Oh, sorry, this is doing it for the continuous variable. I got a mix here of continuous and categorical variables, so I'm just going to stick with this table because this is going to capture everything I want. All right, I'm going to close that up. Again, this is just what is there, and I might choose to do something with it. And this is also important when you're sharing with who you're doing this analysis work for, is that you come over and say, hey, this is some data that's missing. Can we find it? Maybe we can, maybe we can't. And then we'll decide kind of if we're going to go forward with doing something different or not. Now I'm going to just do a quick little summary of a little more detail of what the data looks like. I'm just going to create some graphical displays. So I'm just getting some summary statistics, some charts, some graphs. Again, just trying to get a sense of what the data is. Now, early in my career, I didn't do this, and then I've learned as my career went on. One of the first things I do is I go back to the person I'm helping, who I'm analyzing this data for, whether it's the client or internal client, and I show them something like this. Okay, before I even get to anything sophisticated, I just say, let's just take a look at this data. And I was initially surprised at this, and now it just becomes normal. When you come back and show somebody, hey, this is what the data is, almost every case that I come across, the client is going to redefine the data because they'll look and they'll see something like, oh, you know what? You got these 2 schools, for right now, we're just mostly interested in sort of predicting student performance in this one school. So why don't you hold off on the other school? And early in my career, I would try to go and I would jump right into the sophisticated analyses and modeling. And then afterwards is when the client would say, oh, well, you know what? We should have just analyzed this group of data or this subgroup of data. So I come back now and do this because it helps sort of redefine the analysis. I'm also surprised at how many times, even just this basic information, the customer gets a lot of what they wanted. They're like, oh, you know what? This gave us a lot of information. Why don't you hold off on the analysis yet until I share with my colleagues and we'll get back to you. So don't dive in and start building models and analyzing the data. Come back to the client and say, here's the data. Is this correct? The other thing that I find all the time is you'll show them data like this, and when the client's looking at it, they'll go, wait a minute, those numbers don't look right. They should be lower than that or higher than that, or I should see more, there should be more values in there. And they'll go, oh, wait a minute, we forgot to include this other source, or hold on, these numbers are wrong. Let me go get some new data for you. So again, before you model, just share what you got with the client, because they will often redefine the data. Okay, so again, just looking at what I have, I looked at missing values. Let me just now just sort of take a look at, you know what I'm actually going to do just for the preservation of time. I have analyses already done, and so in some cases, I'm just going to launch it as opposed to going through the steps. So here's just a scatter plot of those 3 grade periods. Of course, they're correlated as you would expect. You know, student performs well in, you know, grade period 1 is probably also going to do the same in 2 and 3. But there's probably something you notice, which is we got a bunch of these values here. I'm going to be highlighting them. And basically what these are is you're starting to see where I've got values of 0. So I'm just going to move over. You see this one highlighted, row 29. So there's a value of 0. Okay. Now that could be a missing value, and then they put a 0. It could actually mean something like the student wasn't there for that grade period, or they dropped out. So this is the kind of thing where when you're sharing with the customer, hey, this is what the data looks like, they may say, hey, you know what? Let's take out all those values. And so I'm just going to highlight all those values, and then I'm going to say hide and exclude. You see how they just disappeared? So now when I go forward, I'm not going to include those students in the analysis. And again, as a practitioner, you can come up with that conclusion a lot, but in interacting frequently with the customer that you're helping, they'll define that with you, and you'll now be aligned and agreed that, aha, we'll only include those observations. So I took those out. So now anything I do going forward will not have that data involved. Okay. So let me go back to my little presentation here. Okay. So we're going to do a little bit of preliminary analysis, and you'll see why for this data set, it's not going to tell us too much information, and we're going to need to rely on some modeling. But I'm just going to create a graph very simply here. I'm going to start off with just putting in, actually I'll put in the first time grade period. And then I'm going to put on the x-axis the school. And I'm just going to make this bigger so you can see it. And then I'm just going to set this up so I can actually swap out. Hang on, I'm going to swap out any of those variables. And then I'm going to do the same thing with what's on the x-axis. And basically what I'm going to do, and let me put this line in here, get the points. I'm basically just kind of switching out variables and then seeing if I can maybe see some differences. So I'm kind of just swapping through. You see on the left, I'm just clicking. I'm just kind of changing, looking to see if certain things stand out. Now, when you have a lot of variables like we have here, when I say failures, I can see a little slope there. When we have a lot of variables like we do here, and there's going to be so much variation, sometimes it's hard. Oh, maybe this one jumps out a little bit. Sometimes it's hard to see variables that stand out. But once we incorporate all of them in an analysis, it'll start to find some relationships. But again, I just like to explore this. And same thing, I always go back to the client, even with something this basic, and just sort of click around to see if we can see any differences, maybe any correlations or relationships. Very, very basic, but I just want to, again, come back to the client and say, hey, here's some things I'm seeing. I'm also surprised at how many times when you do something really basic, the customer says, you know what, this answered a bunch of the questions we had. Why don't you hold off on the model yet? Let me get back to you after I talk to my colleagues. So don't go and hide away and do a bunch of analyses. Try to explain this to your students that when you get out in practice, you have to collaborate very frequently with who you're helping. Bring them along every step of the way, because that person is working with you. Plus, you're getting buy-in the whole time. Okay, it took me some time to learn this. So, try to emphasize this to your students if you're an instructor, and if you're a practitioner, obviously incorporate that when you're doing this kind of work. Okay, so the other thing is we have to think about, well, what are the variables that we're going to use and the variables we're not going to use, just from the perspective of when we have the information. Okay, so we're going to move into this model building. Okay, we're ready to build a model. I know I sped through very quickly this data validation, cleaning, and data exploration. Obviously there's more that you often do, but the key message I want you to get is before you build models, you want to look at the data, share the data with who you're helping, and in collaborating together, you're going to redefine the data, you're going to clean it up together, you're all on the same page. You sort of do a little bit of initial exploration, and you'll be surprised at how many times that process narrows it down. It also answers many questions and redefines the questions. And in the past, as I said, I used to jump right into the model building, and I've learned to not do that. Okay, so some of the things you want to think about when you build a model is the purpose to sort of build a descriptive model so we can kind of quantitatively describe relationships between the variables. Maybe it's purely predictive. We don't care specifically about relationships. We just want to be able to predict very well, and we'll sacrifice interpretation. Who's the audience of the model? I've built models for people who just really need something quick. They just want something directional. Hey, does this variable make the response go up or down? I've also built models that's going all the way to an executive team, all the way to the CEO of a big company, and that's going to completely change how you approach this. Is it just sort of a quick answer, or does this thing get used fundamentally to make serious forecasts for a large organization? So you really want to think about that. Who's the audience, and how important is this model? And that will sort of tell you how quickly and how much time you're going to spend on this. Again, I used to, early on in my career, I wanted to be just very, very thorough. You come right out of academics, and you want to sort of almost impress who you're helping with your sophisticated knowledge, but sometimes it's something really simple, and it's just directional. And think about too does this model need to predict with some level of precision? And that tells you when you're I'm done with model building, because maybe you achieve that really early. The other thing you see in bullet point number 6 is, when is the model to be used? And I'm going to go back to the data set so I can talk about what that means. Is if we're going to be predicting, let's say, the outcome, the final outcome, let's say in grade period 3, and we're going to do that before they even start being in school, well, then we wouldn't have grade period 1 and grade period 2. So that can't really be a part of the model building process. Same thing is, you have to ask yourself, do we have all those variables? So for example, well, we'll know the school they're going to, probably going to know their gender, their age. But as you go through some of these other questions, like their education of their parents, the career of their parents, well, certainly things like study time, how many failures they had in their exams, their activities. We might not know a lot of this information. And so even though we have it right now for our model building exercise, and I can build a model with all these variables, you really have to understand when is the model going to be used, because that's the only variables you're going to be able to include. Think of something like trying to predict if someone's going to default on a loan, like a mortgage or a credit card. Well, probably one of the biggest predictors of that is going to be how many payments they've missed or how many payments they're late. Well, you would only know that once they already have the loan. So you wouldn't be able to do that at the beginning of applying for a mortgage, for example. So it's very common, you'll find really good predictors of outcomes, but that's information you only get later. So based upon that, you might build many different models, all based upon when they get used. If it's at the end of grade period 2 and I'm trying to predict grade period 3, well, then I'm going to be able to incorporate those grades into the model building process. So just to pick something, I'm going to pick that we're going to try to predict grade period 3, so their final grade. We're not going to use any of the other grade information. So we're going to make this prediction right at, let's say, the beginning of being in school. And I'm going to say we have all of these variables. So I'm going to put them all in. But again, to emphasize, we may not have that information at the time, even though I have it now for this exercise. Okay, as many of you know, you always have a choice. Do I want to use all the data that I have sitting here to build a model? Or do I want to use a subset of the data? okay? And reason why that's important is there's this concept in model building that as you make a model more complex, as it's helping explain the data, the error, the prediction error of the model starts going down. But then when it actually ends up happening, as you keep on getting more and more complex of a model, your error actually gets worse. Now, not on the data you're fitting the model to, because as you fit, you're going to get small and small error. But if you take that model and apply it to a different data set. And so we're going to actually use this concept today where we're going to break the data into two groups. One's going to be called the training data, and one's going to be called the validation, or sometimes it's called the test data. Because what happens is as we build these models, we're going to be able to fit the training data better and better and better. And then as we're fitting these more complicated models, what we're actually going to do is compare that fitted model to this test sample or this validation data that I've set aside. And that's how we're going to use that's the criteria we're going to use to determine when we should stop making the model more complex. And many of you have probably seen this concept before. And so it's common that you break it into three groups, like a training and a validation. There's this final one, but I'm just going to break it into two. Okay, so we're going to build a couple different model types. So one, we're going to build a linear regression model. I'm sure most of you know what that is, right? We're going to fit a linear equation to try to describe the data, which is basically just like a surface, right? And then when I have fit this model, I've got these coefficients for the betas, and then when I have a student to make a prediction, I just put the information in, and out comes a prediction. So that's one model we're going to build. Another model we're going to build is called partition. And for those of you who are not familiar with this is a little bit more of an algorithmic way of building a model. So JUMP is going to search through every variable we have, breaking each variable apart if it's categorical, if it's going to continuous, it's going to scan, and it's going to find the place, which variable and where should I cut the data in half such that I cause the biggest difference in the grade score. So in this example, let's say the first variable is variable 5. It's if you take variable 5 and you split it here, you create the biggest difference in the grades of the people in those two groups. And then JUMP will search through again, and maybe within the group of students that are on variable 5 to the right, maybe it splits that group by another variable, x2, right? So those in the left and versus right have the biggest grade difference. Then maybe as it's keep on searching through, it finds, for the students that are in the group on the left-hand side of x2, maybe it splits it again according to another variable. This is called a tree, right, or partition. And once we have that, if you have a student, you just send that student through that tree based upon the criteria for those, the values for those variables, and out at the end comes a prediction. And it's actually very simple. It just uses the average value, okay? The other one we're going to do is called a neural net. This is a little bit more complicated, but it's actually not as conceptually as hard as people think. What it basically does is it sends all of the information through this network. And you can see all those lines. There's only 4 variables there. We have a lot more, but it sends all that information through this network, and it just iterates through over and over and over and over and over again until it converges to a solution where it makes the prediction error as small as possible. And all of those lines you see, basically it's putting weights on those. So it's almost like a linear regression with betas, except it's got a lot more betas, so to speak, because it's connecting through a network. And it sort of iterates through to find the solution. So that's the third one we're going to do. And the fourth one we're going to do is this technique called k-nearest neighbors. And if you're not familiar with this, what it does is it starts off with like, okay, I'm going to take a student. I'm going to look at the student nearest to that student. In other words, across all those variables, most similar, and that's going to be how I'm going to predict that student. And so I do this across like a whole group. Because remember, I get this training and validation set. So I go across and see how well does the nearest student do at predicting that student. And then JUMP will go through and take a look at 2 nearest students. And again, go through all of that, those students that are in that training set, and look at the 2 nearest students, use that as a prediction, and see how well it does. And it keeps on going, and it's going to go to 3 neighbors and 4 neighbors and 5 neighbors. Here I got, here's 7 neighbors. And then it's going to find how many number of neighbors do I make the prediction error the smallest, And let's say the answer comes back and says, okay, it's 5 neighbors. If you take a student and look at the 5 nearest students, use their average score, that could be the best prediction. And so now you've got this, I see it says 4, actually it's 5. You have the 5 nearest neighbors, and that's going to be the model. Okay, so those are the 4 models that we are going to build. Okay. All right. Now this is the beauty of software, because a lot of these things are algorithms, so I can actually move pretty quickly through this. Okay, so I'm going to do the linear regression model first. Okay, so my outcome variable is going to be G3. I've got all my predictor variables here, but I got them all grouped together, so I can just go over here and add them, so they're all there. Okay. And I've got this validation variable, which is basically I have half the data is training, half the data is validation, and so it's going to fit a model to the training data and compare how well that model does to the validation data, and that's how it's going to decide when to stop. So I'm going to launch what's called the stepwise routine, because this is going to be an automated way for me to do this. Okay, so at the bottom, those are all the candidate variables, okay? And I set up a bunch of criteria, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this one here, which is maximize the R squared on the validation data set. So what JUMP is going to do is it's going to find what's the most correlated variable with the response. It puts that in the model. And then with that simple model, looks at the validation data set and says, what's the R square for that? Then it says, okay, tell me the second most important variable. Puts that in the model, looks at the R squared on the validation set. And it goes on and on and on and on until there's a point where the R squared for the validation data set maxes out, okay? So it's basically, I'm just gonna go back to that picture just as a reminder. Back up here. So basically that picture right there. So again, the prediction error gets smaller at the training data set the more and more you fit, but I've got to compare how that model does to the data set I've held aside. Okay. So I can actually just hit go here. I'm going to do that. Whoop. And it just found the variables I should include in my model in a linear regression that maximizes the validation R squared. So I'm actually going to make that model. Okay. So I've got all the variables in here. I'm just going to make a regression model. And I got a bunch of classic statistics, measuring the importance and all of that. The key thing I'm going to look at, but actually I'm going to close all of these because I just want to look at it graphically. Well, I should just note the R squared for this this fit on the training data set is about 34%. And down here, you see for the validation data set is 37. That's a little surprising. Usually it's flipped the other way, but that doesn't mean that can't happen. And just so you get an idea of what this model looks like, I'm just going to bring up a graphical representation. And so this allows me to move the values for the predictor variables around, and then over on the left, I've got a prediction of the grade. It's a confidence interval, so I'm going to see a lower and upper bound, but I can move these around. I mean, there's an equation there, but I find it easier just to look at the visual, especially if you're showing this to someone, right? You can move this around, and then someone could say, hey, how does people in the MS school, males of a certain age, and all these other characteristics, how does this impact your prediction? So you can just keep on running these what if scenarios. Okay, but what I am going to do is I'm going to publish this model, and you just see this little window pop up. I'm basically adding models to this thing that we call a formula depot. Now, obviously, building models is a lot more involved than what I'm doing, right? We might be looking at residuals. We, might be trying different models, maybe trying interaction terms, all that. I'm making this simple because I'm just trying to talk about the predictive modeling workflow. But obviously, there could be much more involved than what I'm doing. I'm just, hitting the go button and getting a model and seeing how it does. Okay. So remember, the other model we're going to do is a partition model. I'm going to launch that. Remember, G3 is going to be my outcome. I've got all my predictive variables, validation data set. Okay. Oh, actually, there's a thing going on here. There's a little methodology called informative missing. There's actually a technique going on behind the scenes that's dealing with the missing values in a statistical way to actually try to incorporate information in there. I won't go into details, but that's something that's actually going on here. So I'm going to hit OK. And basically, it says, OK, I've got 312 students in the training data set, 311 in the validation, right? It's just a 50-50 split about. And if I hit this split button, and it's going to happen really fast, basically what JUMP did is it scanned all of those variables, all of them, and said, okay, where can I split the data according to those variables such that I cause the biggest difference in the grade score? And it found that it was this variable called number of failures. So of the 312 students in this training data set, 263 of them had 0 failures, less than 1. That's basically 0, okay? And the average of those 263 students is right here, 12.6. There were 49 students who had 1 or more failures. And the average of those 49 students is right here, 9.7. And then, of course, we've got some measures of variation. So basically, that's where it's found out if I split by that, I cause the biggest difference in the mean score relative to the variation. It's kind of a common sense concept. It's almost like, where can I find the split such that I would cause the most significant t-test? That's basically what's going on. It's sort of a nice little intuitive thing. Now, I can manually keep on splitting and doing this idea of pruning, but what ends up happening with this technique is that you're going to just keep on splitting and splitting and splitting and splitting, and I'm going to watch the R squared go up. Well, this thing is built to do this automatically. No, so I'm just going to hit this button, go. Okay, so you saw how fast that happened. So basically, here's the tree. Let me make this a little bit bigger so I can make sure you can see it. Okay. So remember, the first split was by number of failures. It took the 263 students who had no failures and said, hey, if we split by this other variable called higher, yes or no, there's 19 over here, 244 over here. That causes the biggest difference in the mean response. Okay. Then it searches through again. Now, it could split any one of these groups, but it's finding, okay, if I take the 244 students in this variable higher yes, and I'm going to split by this variable, this is mother's education, and it finds out, okay, I'm going to put a set of students in there, set of students in there, and that causes the biggest difference in the mean score. It goes again, can I split some more? Yep, this happens to be the amount of alcohol they drink variable. Okay, is it 2 or more? I think this is 2 or more days per week, or less than 2 days a week. And again, that found the biggest difference in the mean. And then it stopped splitting. Well, why did it stop splitting? Well, look at this picture down here in the lower left. Okay, so the blue line is my training data, and on the y-axis is the R squared. So the higher the model's fitting better, the less error. Okay, so the higher it is, it's a better fit. Well, as I split and split and split and split and split, in other words, as I make the model more and more and more complex, well, the R squared for the training data set is going to keep on getting higher and higher and higher. In fact, if I split so much that there was only 1 student in each leaf at the end, well, then I would have an R squared of 100%. But that would be a useless model because it would be horrible at predicting a new set of students. The red line is for each of those splits, look at the R squared when applied to the validation data set, and you see it maxes out. Okay, and so that's why it stopped splitting, because it's like, look, I'm not getting any higher R squared the more you split on the validation data set, so I'm going to stop. Okay, so I'm going to take that model, and I'm also going to publish that, and I'm going to close this. So you see over here in this formula depot, I just put 2 models. That's the least squares model, the linear regression, and the partition model. And you'll see why I'm doing this at the end. Okay, so I said we were also going to build the neural network. I'll pull up the neural network tool. Okay. Put my outcome variable. You see, it's just just drag and drop, point and click, very simple. Put this in here, hit OK. Now, JUMP has all these sort of settings you can tweak, but I'm just going to leave it as the default. And I'm going to hit go. And I mean, that happened really fast. So I've got some measures of fit for the training and validation data set. You can see that right there. Now, I'm going to just show you a picture of what that model is. Okay. Make this, see if I can get it all on the entire screen. Hold on, let me do this. Move this up here. All right, let's make the window bigger. Okay, so as I said, it's taking each one of these variables, it threw them through this network, puts weights on all those lines, it actually runs through this little transfer function, comes out over here, puts weights on all these, and it makes a prediction. And it starts off with just predicting these weights, putting these weights in randomly. And I know it sounds weird. Well, obviously that's not going to be a good fit. I mean, it's almost like putting random betas in a linear regression. Like, well, how could that work? Well, this algorithmic approach just keeps on iterating through, tweaking those weights until eventually it's like, look, I can't make the error any smaller. So it's basically converged to the weights. It's converged to the betas. And if you're not familiar with this, I think a lot of people think, oh, it's too complicated. And yes, the math behind the scenes is a little advanced, but conceptually, it's not that weird at all. In fact, linear regression is actually a special case of this. You can set this up so you get the exact same answer as a linear regression. Now, because it's sort of an algorithmic approach, every time you run it, you're going to get a slightly different number just because of the conversion solution there. And what I'm going to do is the same thing. I'm going to publish this prediction formula. Okay. So you see right now, I've just added the neural network to my little formula depot over here. And the fourth and final modeling technique I'm going to do is this one I called K nearest neighbors. And you see I've got other modeling techniques, but I'm just going to do these four. K nearest neighbors. Put in my outcome variable. Predictors, my validation, and hit OK. You see how fast that happens. So it basically does what I explained. It takes a group of students in this training data and then compares them to the nearest student and sees, hey, how well does that predict? Then it compares it to 2 students, then 3 students, and 4 students, and so on. And I'm basically looking at a plot of the error. That's the root absolute error over there. So the higher the number, the more error. So you'll see that the error kind of comes down and then it levels off. And JUMP's coming back and saying, okay, it's right here basically. It's gonna, this is the number of splits that I'm gonna say, okay, this is where the R squared on the validation data set, and it's 7 splits. Oh, sorry, 7 neighbors, apologize. 7 neighbors says, okay, that's when I make the R squared the largest, or the prediction error the smallest. Okay, and so that's why it has stopped. It has stopped there for the number of neighbors. So basically, this model says if you want to make a prediction, and you've got a student with a bunch of information, look at the nearest 7 students to that student. In other words, nearest in the sense of across all those variables, and then take the average score of those 7 students, and that's your prediction. And that actually turns out to be the best number of neighbors. So I'm going to save that, and now I have that in the formula depot. Okay, so now I'm going to close that. Okay, so what's the point of having this formula depot? Well, now I've got all of these models, these 4 models in one location. And so now I'm going to start comparing them. So I'm going to pick up this model comparison. I'm going to grab them all. And now I can basically look at the R squared for each of these. I mean, I can show you kind of like what those models are predictor, but I can look to see how well those models do in kind of one view. I'm also going to pull up a little profiler here because I'm going to get a visual. Now we got a lot of variables, so this is going to be really, really big here. But basically each one of those rows is one of the models. I've got all the variables listing here. And so now I've got a graphical representation of how the response changes as I change those variables. So the one on the top is the linear regression. So you're going to be most familiar with that, like the classic slope. If it's a continuous variable, or if it's a categorical variable, it's just going to be jumping from one level to the next. Partition is that idea of it's a little step function. So when I go to one or the other, it's just jumping the prediction up or down to one level. And you see a lot of them are flat because those weren't, if you remember, they weren't in the partition model. If they are, I'll see this. But as I go to different categories, remember how it's split. So if I go to this one, higher education, now number of failures is in that. So I can kind of watch this. So I'm on that second row here. So that's what that model looks like. But I can move it around. I can even go in here and type in the numbers instead of sliding it like that. And then over here on the left, I've got a prediction. The third one is the neural network, okay? And I gotta find some settings here where I will actually see some changes there. So as I move to different settings, I will see how the effects of those different variables change. Now, neural networks, because I haven't restricted it to just have a linear shape, it can take on any shape. And so that's why you'll see these little curves. It's almost like little S curves going on here. And so it's not going to be just a linear parameter moving across the predictor variable. It's going to take on all sorts of shapes to capture that. K nearest neighbors is the weirdest looking because every time it moves a variable, it's going to grab another group, a different group of students. And so it's going to jump around the prediction. So that's why you can see how weird that kind of shape is. So this is back to that concept I said is, who is this model for and what are you using it for? If the whole purpose is to try to get parameters that quantitatively describe the relationship between an explanatory variable and an outcome, well, something like linear regression is going to be one of the better models to describe because it's going to have this easy coefficient for beta. K nearest neighbors is very hard to describe. Right? How would you describe, for example, let's look at this second column here. How would you describe how the number of absences affects the prediction of the grade? It's really weird, right? It goes up, comes back down, then it goes up. And so K nearest neighbors is one of those ones that are like, wow, it's really hard to describe. It's really hard to describe how each variable affects it. I can certainly look at it visually, but it's quite complicated. However, if it turned out to be my best predictor, and that's what I care about the most is prediction ability, then maybe I'm gonna be fine. Okay. Now what I'm gonna do, one more second here. Oh, I have this set up just actually to do one group, but that's okay. But for the preservation of time, I'll still move forward. Okay, so let's say I'm like, all right, I'm gonna look at these and I decide, well, I'm gonna use the linear regression. And maybe because I'm like, okay, it's got the best predictive ability, or maybe it's because it's the best descriptive ability, or some kind of combination of both. I'm gonna say, aha, I'm gonna use that model. Well, now I need to take that model and I need to productionalize it. And what I mean by that is I'm gonna take it outside of JUMP, because who might be using this model isn't going to be somebody using the JUMP software. This might be sitting in some computational environment where as information comes in, the prediction happens. Okay, so think, for example, if this was a model about predicting someone's likelihood of defaulting on a loan, and I built this model, well, I need that model to sit somewhere in some computing environment, so when someone applies for a loan and you fill out all the information, the prediction of, oh, this person has this probability of defaulting, so the bank can decide the details of that loan, that's going to be done outside of JUMP. Okay, so I need to write code, so to speak, to let that happen. Well, I can do that automatically. So I have a choice to write this in C or Python. I can write SAS code, of course, JUMP being a SAS product. I'm going to choose Python. That's a very common language in the data science world. And I'm going to pick it for the least squares model. I hit OK. And right here, now the linear regression model is not too complicated. It's just an equation, so the code isn't too long. But I just automatically generated Python code so that I can then implement this in an environment outside of JUMP. And you saw that there were other languages there, or I could have picked other models, but I picked the linear the linear regression model. Now I'm going to just finish up with just one last thing, and then we'll get to some Q&A. I often like to take a look at visually how the model predicts and start doing it by different variables. And so what I just did, and I'm just dragging these variables into this graph, but with preservation of time, I'll just show one that I've already made. So basically what I've got set up over here is on the left, I can switch between any of the explanatory variables that are in the model, okay, over on the left, and that's what gets plotted in these panels. So school, there's 2 panels. Gender, there's 2 panels. Age, there's more, okay? And basically what's being plotted on the x-axis is the residuals, the variation around that fitted model, and 0 would be the fitted model. So I can look at the spread around that. And I color-coded it so that the training data is blue and the validation data is red. And I've got my 4 models here. So I've got linear regression, partition, neural network, k-nearest neighbors. So this is where I can not just rely on numerical values, but I can start kind of digging in and make other decisions. So for example, I'm clicking on age. Notice I don't have a lot of students that are 20, 21, and 22. Maybe I'm going to take those out and refit the model. This is also where I might identify some outliers or some unusual observations. So this is a little bit more a detailed view of the model's performance against the actual data, all 4 models, moving across the variables, training and validation data set. So now it's almost like I'm zooming into this model, really looking at it relative to the actual values and looking at my predictions across the models. And again, this is what I might take this and redefine the models I'm going to do, or identify interesting students to explore. Okay, obviously the world of model building is a lot more than I've just done right there, but let me see if I, just at the end, I think I just have the one last slide. Yeah, just the one last slide, so that's it. Okay, Bill, do you want to open it up to some questions? I know some might have been answered along the way.
Yeah, thanks. That was wonderful. Kurt's been answering some questions on live while everything was going, while you were presenting. So we've got more. We've got one more coming in right now. Folks on the call, feel free to post questions via the Q&A function that you want answered. We've got about 10 minutes left in our webinar, where we'll have Kevin and Kurt on. So feel free to have those coming in. Kevin, can you see the Q&A, the function, and see what that first question?
Yeah, let me pop that up.
I did answer this the best I can, but it might be easier to show, Kevin, how you created a validation column in your data set.
Let's see. Oh, okay. So is this the question you're referring to about the maximum R squared is just 36%? Or is that a different question?
Oh, I think Kurt answered another one, but that is the most recent one that's on there. The maximum R squared is just 36%. Yeah. How can we improve the prediction models?
Okay. So I'll start off with saying, maybe just 36% is not the right way to say it. We could be like, wow, we've achieved 36%, right? I know a lot of times we think, oh, we want R squared to be very high. Well, in data sets like this, there's so much variation. There's so many factors that impact something. This might be as high as we can get with this kind of problem. Social sciences and those kind of applications are really hard to get high R squared. If we're dealing with like scientific engineering environments, working in a lab, well, those we can obviously achieve higher R squared. However, with all that said, classic thing, we could redefine the data. Maybe we hone in on specific data sets because parts of the data, because it might be certain variables that are kind of preventing that R squared from getting any better. There could be more information. We could find other variables that are better predictors than the ones we have here. We could also make more complicated models. Now, when I did the linear regression, I only put what are called main effects, but there could be interactions where the variables actually interact with each other, right? So it's not just each variable has an effect independently, but they interact together to cause a prediction. I could have tried that. There's also this technique, and I didn't do this, but I typically do this, is if you fit a bunch of models, you can almost think that each one of those models is trying to take a guess at something, right? Each one of those models is trying to predict, hey, I can predict the student performance. Let me take a shot at it. And the other model is saying, hey, I can take a prediction. Why don't I try it? Well, imagine you and your friends were sitting around trying to predict an outcome, and 5 of you had an answer of predicting something. Like, let's say, you know, the score of a game that you're going to watch this weekend. You all had, you know, a prediction of how many points the team's going to score. If I was sitting there listening to the 5 of you make the prediction and I was going to make a prediction, I might just take all 5 of your scores and average them. Okay. So there's this, it's called ensemble methods, which is maybe a little sophisticated of a term, but sometimes it turns out if you take a bunch of models and average them together, average all their predictions better, sometimes that actually can improve the R squared, because, you know, think of it, one model might be under predicting a little bit, another model might be over predicting a little bit, but collectively they work. Now, with that said, I highly doubt the R squared is going to get that much better with this kind of data set. Maybe you can kick it up to 40 or a little bit more, but we're not going to turn this into 80%, even if we tried different models or did some ensemble method.
Great. We have another one from Arun. How can the productionalized stage happen if real-time data is used?
That's kind of the beauty of it, is because, well, I guess there's 2 things. If once I put this in the production environment, then I can sit there and that's just making predictions automatically, right? As data comes in, right? Information comes in a real-time environment. It's just whether I put it in Python or C, whatever environment, then it's just going to make a prediction automatically. Now, if I get a new set of data, let's say, hey, we got 100 new students, well, I'm going back to the model building exercise, right? That's where I want to try different variables, try different models. So now I'm not in the production environment anymore. I'm back to the model building exercise. And in that case, I sort of got to rebuild, retrain my model. And now I'm doing something similar to what I did. So those 2 things, think of those 2 things as separate. There's a place where the model automatically scores that I fit a model, and then it's scoring automatically with new data. And then there's the concept of, I have new data. I actually have to go through the process of model building, and I got to give it a chance to possibly have a different model, maybe different variables, and because I got different data. So, and all those coefficients are gonna be different.
Perfect. That sounds great. Another question's come in. How can we make 2 KPIs to predict the best fit model? For example, R squared and MSE to predict the best model. Is it possible with JUMP?
Yeah, you know, R squared, if you look at the formula for R squared, it's basically looking at the sums of squares or the mean squared. So the model that's going to have the highest R squared is going to have the smallest mean square error. So there's a direct link between those two expressions. We were just focusing on R squared, but there are certainly other metrics. R squared is one of the most common. So I could have chosen other ones to decide other criteria, but in this case, I think R squared captures almost everything I'm looking for, because it's basically variation around the prediction. But I could express that as a percent error. That's kind of common, you know, which one has the largest percent error.
Great. We have another one that came in via the chat from Martin. Can we see the predictions of each model against the real grades in the database?
Oh, yes. So I'm going to go back to share screen. I'll show you that graph in one of them. Again, I was moving through this very quickly, so there's only, you know, so much I can show. Bill, you can see the screen with JUMP?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So I'm just gonna bring this. This is the results of the linear regression. I mean, I ran it and then closed it really quickly, but you know, here are all fit metrics, right? Coefficients. I just focused on the visual, the profiler, but here are some of those other metrics that we're seeing here. Okay, here's your root mean square error right here. Just on that question, I'm going to drop down this little red triangle. This is where I can do some other follow-up analyses related to this. Like I can do like residual plots, all of that. I sort of manually made the residual plots because I wanted to put all the models together. But for each model, I can plot the residuals here. all the kind of check the assumptions and all of that. But one of the ones I selected that's sitting here on the top is a plot of the actual scores. That's on the y-axis. I'm just going to make it bigger to help you see it. And on the x-axis is the predicted value. Right? Now, ideally, those points would lie very close to that line, right? That in other words, the predictions are highly correlated with the actual values. But there's a lot of variation here, and we're seeing that. We actually might even argue that there's a little weird shape in here, and maybe linear regression isn't best to capture some of that dynamic that's going on, partly because, you know, we're only going to, you know, the prediction's going to level off at some point. So this is a plot of actual versus predicted. That's part of each of these outputs. So every model I ran, I could get that if I wanted to, but I kind of liked building this graph that I did at the end that I showed you, because now I can kind of look at the residuals relative to that, right? 'Cause that's the same idea, right? The red line is the prediction, and the variation around it, I can actually just see from this graph. But right from here, I can do the same thing. I didn't show you this, but every time I ran a model, I'm just going to scroll over so you can see. Every time I ran a model, oh, I got them hidden. Unhide them. Every time I ran a model, I saved fitted values and residuals sitting over here. And that's that. Once I had those, then I can start creating any of those graphs that you want to see. Now, you might notice that there's missing values in here, and a lot of that is because we have missing values in the data, and depending upon the modeling technique, some modeling techniques have to kick out the entire row if there's something missing somewhere. And I didn't show you all the missing values, you know, walking through each one, but if you remember, we had quite a bit of missing values.
All right.
All right. Well,
that's the end of the Q&A. Looks like we're all out of questions. Appreciate everyone's cooperation and everyone's engagement. Anything else to leave the folks with?
Yeah, Bill, I just want to point out, I'm right on the jump.com website. If you go here, you can learn about the capabilities of the software. You can take a look at the applications, the tools that we have, the types of companies and universities that are using it. We also have webinars that we do. I think when I counted up recently, I think I found about 125 webinars on here. So you can kind of dig in here. Obviously, you can download a quick little demo and easily learn about JUMP. I've recorded this, so I will provide Bill with and I think, Bill, you're recording it on your end too, but I'll give you mine in case the audio is a little bit better on my side. And I'll also send you the data set. So if anybody's interested in the data set because they want to incorporate it in their class, they're welcome to do that.
And what about the presentation?
Oh, same thing as well. Yes.
That's what we thought.
Send you those slides.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Kurt. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. On behalf of Kurt, Kevin of JUMP, and everyone here in Informs, I thank you for your cooperation today and your participation. Recording of the webinar will be available on our YouTube channel very soon. I encourage you to join us for our next webinar. And I appreciate everyone taking the time today. Have a wonderful day and a wonderful weekend.
All right, thanks, everyone. Be safe, be healthy.
That's right.